My name is Simon Cohen, founder of Cohesis, and today I'm joined by Dan Leverington, founder of the Ocelli Group, which specializes in helping boards and executive teams navigate the increasingly complex ESG and digital sustainability landscape. Dan, hello and welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. To kick off, please tell everyone about how you got into digital sustainability and what led you to start the Ocelli Group.
I have spent a fair bit of time within technology over my career. I recruited within the Salesforce space. I worked at Gartner. I've worked in startup world for a job aggregator platform called Adzuna. So technology is something that has always been a part of my career. And then as my career progressed, I started realizing that the practice of sustainability was going to move from being volume 2 of CSR, so to speak, and much more into the core operating model of organizations. And so the combination of those two areas of my work started to come together. And so that got me into digital sustainability. And then I started seeing a lot of crossovers between what CTOs and CIOs had been through 10 or 15 years ago and what chief sustainability officers are going through now. And that is a lack of resource, lack of budget, not always a seat at the table, not always a say in the direction. And so that for me was kind of the first major market data point. And from there, I started realizing that they needed introductions to suppliers within sustainability. And that was the start of the Ocelli Group.
Excellent. So what kind of clients do you typically work with?
For sure. So most companies that we work with are anywhere between 50 employees and 500 employees. The reason why we focus on that area of the market is from a mandatory climate reporting perspective, which starts 1st of January. That cohort makes up Group 2 and Group 3. And we know that they're one of the most underserved areas of the sustainability and climate space. And so we do that across all manner of industries because we have over 45 suppliers who specialize in one or multiple of those industries.
So tell us around what's coming in at the start of the year then, because obviously you mentioned CSR, corporate sustainability reporting and what have you. That's been, to my knowledge at least, being led by the EU in terms of the CSRD. And it feels like we're playing a little bit of catch up here and also to align more globally with those kind of regulations. But maybe explain a little bit about what's coming in January and the types of things that those kind of businesses need to consider.
Absolutely. That's a really good summation, Simon. So all national reporting feeds into the Paris Agreement, which was agreed in 2015 amongst all 197 countries. In order for countries to hit their targets under the Paris Agreement, they need to have an understanding of what is actually happening in their own countries. And so this mandatory climate reporting that Australia is about to embark on and that has now been legislated by the federal parliament is almost identical to the legislation that's in the EU, that's in the UK, that's working through different levels of government in the US, Argentina, Japan. So this is not Australia going out on its own. This is Australia coming in line with what's happening globally. For an Australian specific focus, so the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards, or the ASRS, which you may see it written as, they require companies to report to the regulators as they would under Chapter 2M of the Corporations Act, and so that's where the financial disclosures sit. The 4 areas that companies really need to focus on is from a governance level, which is up to the board, from a strategy level, which is up to the executives, and then from a risk management and metrics and targets perspective. And that is all to do with how is the company currently performing when it comes to their engagement with the climate, and what level of risk is the company at if certain scenarios come to pass. So that's around global temperature increasing. So that can be 1.5 degrees is probably something, a number that a lot of people have heard. So that's the minimum, right? And so under climate scenario analysis, companies are going to have to publicly disclose to the regulator, this is the risks and opportunities that we expect our company to face if global temperatures rise to 1.5 degrees, or if they go well above 2. So, for example, what's the difference that a company faces that's a manufacturing company if temperatures rise 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels versus what challenges do they face if it rises to 2.5 degrees above? And 1 degree doesn't sound like a lot, but the best way that it's been explained to me is if you put an ice cube on a driveway and it increases by 1 degree, it turns to water a lot faster. So that's kind of the thinking behind it. That's obviously thinking about it from a risk perspective, but where companies who are leading in the space approaching it from is actually from an opportunity perspective. So how can they change their energy sources, for example, to be renewable energy? How can they change their lighting, their energy requirements so that they're more energy efficient? And then how can they save money by doing that? And that's, like that. It's a very, very fast moving space at the moment.
So there's a couple of things in it, and that's an excellent answer. Thank you. But there's a couple of things here that remind me of maybe where we were with GDPR and data protection. So EU brings out a new directive, then trading partners, countries, regions, regional areas are then mandated that if they want to trade with a particular block, they have to uplift their own maturity and compliance in specific areas. That then trickles down a whole load of, I would say, related compliance angles or compliance frameworks that people have to comply with, and then there's a whole scramble to be able to be compliant by a particular time frame. The difference that I see with, we say, between GDPR and say with ESG and what have you, and the related compliance coming in, is somehow because GDPR was very much around, is obviously data protection. Organizations had, I don't know, more information at hand. They knew what data sets that they had, and they were able to, it was easier to run utilities across, or at least understand. It may still have been complicated, and there still may have been a lot of tools, but I think the increasing challenge that I see with organizations in this space is where to get the data, how to get the data, how do we measure, how do we report? And even if there is a drive that organizations want to be compliant, it's like, well, how? And I think that's where I see it as being almost like a more difficult proposition for many organizations than, say, what GDPR was. Not as I'm trying to say that GDPR was easy. I'm just trying to say that this actually feels as though it is somewhat a little bit more difficult.
For sure. I love the fact that you use GDPR because I think it's a great example. Can you give us an overview of why GDPR was brought in originally?
Well, it was really around the increasing threat of security, data leaks, and people becoming increasingly frustrated that organizations weren't doing enough to protect their data. And it was personal to them. I think also that was the thing, it was personal to them. And the thing around the environment is, yes, it's very personal to many, many people, but it's not the same kind of level of personal kind of impact. If somebody leaks your data, you feel it. If your identity's been stolen, you feel it. So there's a greater clamor at that point and a greater drive. And there was probably fewer naysayers around implementing something like that. Whereas here you've got, kind of climate deniers as well. And there's a battle around information in that space. But obviously now it's coming in. I think one of the greatest challenges is, and you talk about risk and compliance, which is obviously an area close to my heart as well. But the greatest challenge is actually really getting people to understand maybe why it's needed, how to actually achieve it, and what is the benefit. Because I know a lot of business leaders will say, look, hang on a sec, there's a whole load of costs coming down here. It's a big imposition, it's a big cost, it's a time suck. What are we going to get out of it? And 1 degree as you say, doesn't sound like a lot. And actually that 1 degree isn't affecting me right now. So why should I care? Obviously there's the greater good and what have you. But, how are you driving that kind of gap in terms of that desire for people to actually want that change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the areas that GDPR almost had a softer landing is it is very easy to determine when there is a single company that has been breached and is responsible for individual data.
Yes.
Being it's so like we can rattle all the ones in the past 12 months off the top of our heads in Australia, right? Because they've made big news, and where the climate space, as you correctly identify, is more difficult is just because there are wildfires in WA or bushfires in WA. You can't necessarily trace that back to a single company. And I think
that's a very good point.
Like that's the difference from a complexity level is the responsibility of the organization is much more difficult to actually nail. However, where we're seeing a lot of pressure, there's effectively 4 or 5 specific different stakeholders that are pressuring companies to act. So the first is compliance. So with directors being personally liable under Chapter 2M of the Corporations Act, they have to comply with this information. And I know ASIC is going to be, and the ACCC are going to be looking at this very closely. And they are going to want to see that at a bare minimum, companies have completed a climate gap analysis, which is not a straightforward piece of work because you are having to take into account your entire operations from inside your 4 walls to the emissions generated by the power that you're using for electricity, and then which is Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and then Scope 3 emissions are the emissions that are in your supply chain, and that gets very complicated. The reason why each company, based on their reporting group, so Group 1, as we said, will start in 1st of Jan next year, or 2025. Group 2 will be 1st of July 2026, and then Group 3 will be 1st of July 2027. That'll be for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions for each group will be the following year after they start reporting. And the reason why it's been done like that is that if each company in the supply chain already has their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, they're going to have a lot more data to share up and down their supply chain for everyone to figure out what their Scope 3 is. And so that's just something to tuck away.
So
the complete...
sorry to cut in, but just in terms of those Group 1 and Group 2s, if I've understood it correctly, Group 1 is roughly around $500 million in terms of revenue. Group 2 is 200 million and Group 3 is around 50 million. So just so the audience can kind of put that into context, into some kind of context. I think to the point that I think you're saying there is that those larger organizations, they get a bit of a head start and what have you, and because they've obviously, they're like big oil tankers or what have you, having to adjust accordingly. But the challenge that I see, and it's, I think, again, coming back to maybe GDPR, using that as a kind of like parallel thread, is that larger organizations then needed to know what other organizations in the supply chain and their suppliers, what they were doing to mandate security. And I think there'll be the same kind of trickle down thing here that, I mean, I don't really work, and Cohesis doesn't really work with $500 million or $200 million clients, but, we do work with some organizations that are maybe touching in and around the $50 million, maybe slightly smaller. But what I can see from my kind of client base is the fact that the trickle down from, say, the $50 million companies that have smaller organizations in their supply chain, those organizations are going to, if they want to continue to do business with their larger organizations, they're going to have to automatically get their own house in order. And I think that's going to be painful because they're going to all of a sudden be imposed with a particular cost as a cost of doing business that they're probably not thinking that is going to be relevant to them. And I think that's the kind of latent iceberg that I see being out there, for, even if that's a term, a latent iceberg, I don't know.
I like it.
But that is the kind of threat, I think, for the smaller organizations, even though they're not wrapped up into the initial legislation. They're going to have to contend with this anyway. Do you see that? Do you agree with that? Or what's your thoughts?
I do, but there are solutions out there, particularly for small to medium businesses, and particularly from a carbon management perspective. Yeah, and it can be pretty seamless exercise. Like for the larger organizations, for sure. Like this is a very expensive exercise for them to be undertaking, but it's not just because of compliance. So there's the compliance piece, which is important. However, global investment is very quickly moving to de-risk their investment portfolios from companies that are like high emitters, because from a long-term investment perspective, they want to know that the companies that they're investing in are going to be there for the long term. And so a lot of the money is moving towards companies that are taking this seriously. So you have the investor piece. Because you have the investor piece, you have the compliance piece, you also couple this with the insurance industry. Now, the insurance industry is starting to increase insurance premiums based on the performance of companies and whether they have climate risk and climate transition action plans, because that shows the insurance company that their client or their customer is aware of what the next few decades are going to look like for them, and they are taking active measures to do so. So you've got investors, you've got insurance, you've got compliance. Because those three are above the larger organizations and the customers, so the larger organizations need to be providing this climate information. They are then doing exactly what you just discussed from a supply chain perspective. They're going to their supply chain and saying, we need this information from you because we need to pass this information on. So then you've got four stakeholders that way. The other two, I think, are equally as important, but don't get as much attention. The first is customers. So there's clearly, particularly on the consumer side, there is clearly a movement towards customers wanting to vote with their wallets in terms of the companies that they're supporting. So you've got pretty significant commercial pressure there. And then the final one is employees. Like there is a lot of data around the productivity levels and therefore the flow and effects from a revenue perspective for companies who are engaging their employees in a way that matches with the way that employees like to work. They're willing, or that their desire to work for businesses that are providing a net benefit, net positive. And so all of a sudden, there is a lot of pressures on boards and executive teams in Australia at the moment to be taking this very seriously. Like we have well and truly moved away from this is just something that the hippies care about to now being a very significant commercial risk if companies don't get this right.
Yeah, no, and that's fair. And look, if we pull apart some of those things, so ESG, environment, social, and governance, they're big topics in and of their own right. And yes, it is absolutely, from an environment perspective, waste management and managing resources wisely. From a social perspective, it's how organizations treat people, whether it's customers, suppliers, staff, and all in around things like diversity, good working conditions. So, there's some big topics in there. And then obviously, as we've alluded to a few times, it's coming back to governance, compliance, risk management, all of those kind of things. And to make sure that organizations are following their own guidelines or industry guidelines as well. So they're big ticket items in each of those areas that will all need their own reporting, their own frameworks, their own, view in terms of for their size and what have you. Are they complying with each of those areas? And that kind of obviously trickles down from, especially from an environment perspective, that kind of trickles down, what we're talking about with the increase in terms of, 1 degree in temperature and what have you. I think the others are the social and the governance support, part of that trinity. But what I often hear are the terms ESG and digital sustainability being used interchangeably. And one of the things that I'm interested just to kind of talk about is And I'm guilty of doing it myself sometimes as well, especially when in conversations where it's just flowing like that. But maybe for the audience, in your view, how would you say that, what is the difference between ESG and digital sustainability, and how do they overlap?
For sure. So the term ESG was coined in 2004, and it was specifically in relation to an investment decision, in terms of how can a company that wants to make outsized returns over an extended period of time, such as, think of pension funds, for example, particularly sovereign wealth funds are another one, how can they ensure that the businesses that they're investing in will be around for decades? And so that's where the E, the S, and the G really came from. It was a lens or a filter for investment firms to determine which companies they were going to invest in. It's now spawned into a much larger conversation, right? I don't think we'll still be talking about ESG in the next 5-10 years the way that we are now, because of exactly what you just said. It's too big. It makes sense from an investment perspective, because you're able to determine, is this the kind of company that I want to invest in? Is this the kind of company that I don't want to invest in? And that's not even just from personal preference perspective. That's just market forces perspective. Like the price of oil and gas or coal or iron ore, do I expect that over the next 30 to 40 years, they're going to go down rather than up? Do I believe that this company is at risk of litigation because of X behavior? If so, I don't want to invest in them. So it's a very quantifiable framework. From an economy perspective, and an industry perspective, you really want to be determining how can we as a business put ourselves on the best foot to continue making money. Like that's what a business does, right? And if the best way to do that is to be able to reduce our costs, to increase the amount of client work that we can win, that we can tender for, companies are going to make that decision independently of everything else, right? Like their motivation is to put themselves in the strongest commercial space possible. And I think ESG, up until this point, and probably for the next few years, provides a really good way to do that. Like we know from a hiring perspective, for example, that there's a higher attraction rate, a higher engagement rate of existing employees, and the higher productivity rate that I mentioned earlier. So it's been useful up until this point, but I think it will fade away as these practices just become, as you said, the cost of doing business. And that is, I don't think it's that far away, to be honest with you.
No. So then if I take what you've said there and assume that actually the transition will be more towards digital sustainability and the focus on those, because let's face it, most of the, I suppose, problems are going to be technology in some way, shape or form, and the cost of technology, and the solutions are likely to be technology driven as well. The reporting elements to how we're going to find out what our carbon emissions are and what have you, or whatever the other metrics an organization needs to report against, are going to be driven by technology in some way. So the focus is very much going to be on digital sustainability, and that kind of leads more into I would say more in terms of Cohesis's and role in terms of how we help organizations from a technology risk perspective. Now, how do you see the changing landscape for digital transformation then in view of digital sustainability?
So I get the sense that some stakeholders are still hoping that we can go back to how things were in, say, 2019. Like I get that sense there's like a nostalgia for, well, like if only once we get back to where we were, then everything will be easier. But I'm pretty sure you would have seen this in your experience in technology. That's not going to be the case. Like if anything, the the adoption of technology is only increasing. And because of that, not only do you have more complexity, but you also have more data points. And you're totally right when it comes to reporting. Those data points can only really be evaluated effectively with having the technology that you're speaking about to do the work. So from a digital sustainability perspective, then the conversation becomes, okay, well, based on our service providers that we're using for the technology work, what do their scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions look like? What benefits can we get from AI, for example? What benefits can we get from new technologies such as renewables? What benefits can we see by implementing a platform like we're using, right? So that we're minimizing staff travel where appropriate. And so I absolutely agree that technology has to become at the core of business operations, because if it doesn't, you're leaving too much risk exposure on the table by not having the visibility that the technology offers. And I think that's where Cohesis really comes in from that risk and compliance perspective, because you're able to provide those insights, those heat maps for companies to become more aware of their risk exposure than that they potentially are at the moment.
Yeah, and one of the things, so I was doing a talk recently for a group of local government organisations, and it was on digital sustainability. And one of the things that I was reflecting upon as I was doing a bit of research, I was doing a bit of reading around it, is that there was a comment or some information from the UN Environment Programme, and it was talking around digitalization for sustainability and sustainable digitalization. And there was a throwaway line that I got out of it as part of the writing. And it was talking about sustainability by design. So digital sustainability by design. And then it took me back to, saying go back to how things were. It took me back to the early parts of my career, just in the 2000s and what have you, when I was working for an organization where performance was and the speed at which, the thing, Big Brother, where everyone presses the button at the same time, and how do you make sure that those requests aren't lost? It was all about designing systems for performance, for peak traffic and things like that. And then that was like 2000s and onwards. And then security became a thing, a really big thing. And then the 2010s was security by design. So we've gone from performance by design into software to security by design. And now the talk is of digital sustainability by design. And so the evolution of that kind of thinking around, okay, when we're going to deploy or build or implement technology, we're now going into the next phase of what we have to consider is built in by design. And now you wouldn't think about not building security by design into anything that you do. You wouldn't think about not considering performance. And I think the next phase, as we go through, you say go back to where it was in 2019, but in my head, it's like the 2020s kind of onwards kind of thing, is digital sustainability. And from my perspective, yes, we do work in risk and compliance, and we help organizations kind of achieve that in terms of understanding where they are and how to manage risk against typically technology related frameworks. I think where we cross over is in this digital sustainability space, and how organizations kind of gear up for that in terms of what they do and how are they going to build in their next implementations and make them sustainable. Or in essence, if we really abstract out digital sustainability, I always think about it's doing more with less. How can you do what you're doing as efficiently and effectively as possible? And for me, that comes back to things like, what are your people doing? You mentioned it before, what's your people doing? How effective are your processes, and how does technology align, bring those together as the glue or what have you, the supporting bit underneath. And I think the way that I would see it is that as organizations make change, technology change, whatever that is, a new application, new system, new group of systems, new servers, whatever, are we making the right decision from a business perspective, from a finance perspective, will this technology make the business run better? Also how's it going to impact the environment? It may run better, but what's going to be the environmental impact? Or is there a net gain, that we can do? And that's that's where we started getting talking as well, isn't it? So taking that thought, how do you see that kind of like, these initial three cohorts and maybe some of the smaller organizations, how do you see that kind of thinking landing with senior leadership boards, etc.? Do you see that as a way that will help them make that leap like less grudgingly, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. So like one of the big evolutions probably of the past 5 years is the realization that climate risk is financial risk. And I think up
Yes.
until that point, and still for a lot of companies, they do see them as separate. It's like we get our house in order on one side, and then once we've done that, then we make sure we're looking after the environment and planting trees and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, well, once you shift the mindset to realize that not only is it your impact on the environment, but it's also the environment's impact on your business, and that's what we refer to as a double materiality assessment. That totally changes the conversation, right? Because all of a sudden you're starting to think, well, how do we mitigate against that happening? And if that is to happen, how do we adapt our supply chains, our operations to ensure that we still have money coming in the door? Which sounds quite extreme, but I'm pretty sure most people can remember what it was like at the start of COVID when global supply chains just ground to a halt, and we very quickly had to figure out solutions. And we did. So it's not like we're not capable of doing it. It's just I think because the risk is so decentralized across so many different businesses, it's quite difficult for companies who haven't been through the climate gap analysis process to actually visualize what it looks like in terms of the environmental impact on their business. And that seems to be like climate risk as a financial risk seems to be for a lot of companies the light bulb moment that they need to really start thinking about this. But as you were speaking about your experience in tech, I'd love to hear, like, what are some of the objections that you remember hearing from companies when you were speaking to them about performance, when you were speaking to them about security before it was, accepted as the cost of doing business?
So performance is an interesting one. So I did some work with, as part of an organization that I was working in at the time with Channel 4 in the UK. And Channel 4 was the TV channel that hosted Big Brother. So they had a moment where you voted people out. We called it there's a presenter called Davina McCall, and there was the Davina moment where she says, right, vote now. And then that spawned a whole load of traffic. And that traffic had to be dealt with in particular. So you didn't want to lose people's votes and things like that. But there was an enormous spike. Similarly, around the time of football competitions, and I remember, I think it was the Associated Press, had to delay their coverage a little bit because they got their servers so fast that sometimes the change in score would appear before the actual play had caught up. So they had to slow it down and things like that. So there was challenges around performance, but they're just a couple of examples. But for, I say, normal organizations, performance is one of those things that is very hard to quantify, but you know when you don't have it. So, and because it was at the time, well, if something takes 3 seconds, is that slow? Is it 5 seconds? And then there was the kind of thing, look, if it's more than 7 seconds, someone's left your web page. So, and then it kind of came down from there. Also did some work in the UK with an organization called ASOS, which is a online clothing brand. And they rewrote their shopping cart and some of their website, basically because they wanted to increase a second of performance speed in the checkout process. And for them, a second in performance, like the 1 degree for the ice cube, a second in performance was $1 million, £1 million, I should say, £1 million a month kind of thing.
Wow.
In terms of checkout. Then, for those organizations where it mattered, it really mattered. You know what I mean? If you've got just a brochure site and it took a few longer seconds and there's no transactions, no one cared. But for something where it really mattered, then people cared about it. When it comes to security, a similar kind of thing. People didn't think it was going to affect them. People didn't think it was going to, that they wouldn't get breached by a cyber attack, until all of a sudden more and more people got breached. Then it became a thing. And then all of a sudden people became more, interested in, is my data secure? Is it encrypted? All of a sudden, people that wouldn't even have cared about encrypted data, all of a sudden, cared a lot. And now we come into, and so again, it was educating many of those organizations, there's still many today don't believe security is, as big a deal as what it needs to be, pay lip service to it. There's many others that really get it and really understand. And I would say that in terms of the spaces that we play in terms of Cohesis and Agendis from a technology perspective, then security is one of those things that is expected now. From a risk management perspective, it's still with some organizations. We talk about Essential 8, and we do a lot of work around Essential 8, which is, one of the kind of main frameworks that local governments and other organizations kind of deal with. Is around understanding and really kind of applying those frameworks. So the thing is with Essential 8, it's actually harder than what it sounds. Even something that sounds simple, like whitelist the applications you want to whitelist. For some organizations, that's a really complicated thing. For other organizations, especially in local government, getting rid of macros in spreadsheets is harder than what it sounds, because those macros are needed. So then all of a sudden, the framework is really difficult to achieve, or compliance with the framework is really difficult to achieve. So this is where things like what we do in terms of helping organizations assess, well, do you really need to spend X amount of extra dollars to really meet that level of that framework, or could that be applied, in a more effective way? Yeah. And I think in a similar kind of way, we're going to have the same conversations with digital sustainability. So the way that we attack it and help organizations kind of, attack it head on is, can you do more with less? I really love that, because that distills it down. Is you can still achieve more from an operational, organizational, security, performance, whatever perspective, but can you do it with less? And that's it. Yeah. And if you're doing that's achieving the elements of everything. It's the fundamental thing that you can try and achieve. With less money, with less time, people's time, less resources, etc. So if you can do more with less, that's obviously a good way forward. But then it's a case of, I think it's around, okay, a client of ours may want to do a particular type of implementation. How is that going to be more effective? Or I'll have people say to me, well, we can go into the cloud, it will save all of our CapEx expenditure, because we won't need servers on site. Yeah. But then there's the concept of not all clouds are the same. So and the way that hosting is provisioned and things like that can be very different. The way that networks are set up in the cloud and what have you can vary from based on design, can vary based on vendor, can vary based on a lot of things. So it's around making those right technology decisions that lead into right sustainable decisions. And I kind of see it as being digital sustainability lenses being an extension of digital transformation lenses.
Yeah, definitely. Because I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, because the digital transformation lenses, we've got our own approaches and methodologies and graphics and stuff like that we kind of show clients, this is how we'll work if we work with you and what have you. And that's kind of fairly well understood. It's not necessarily, we have our own approach, but, other organizations do, I'm sure, very similar, same things. The next thing is put those digital sustainability lenses on top to then make sure that actually the transformation that you're looking to achieve meets those other criteria as well. And that's how I have been having those conversations with our clients, is how to try and achieve that. The bit that where we don't get into, where I think your area is around that reporting level. We help, if there's a framework there, we can help determine whether someone has applied it or met it with our software and what have you. But where I think your organization and the Ocelli Group and what have you come in, it will be around really helping them understand what should be reported upon and how to drive that. And maybe talk a bit about that in the sense of how do you drive that improvement in reporting capability?
Yeah, for sure. So a part of the suppliers that we have, within the Ocelli Group, there's over 45 companies that are our partners. They're across three very specific pillars. So the first is sustainability consultancies. The second is sustainability data platforms. And the third are communications and marketing agencies that only work with companies that have completed the first two. And I say the first two because from a consulting perspective, these are the companies that specialize within industries that understand what the new mandatory climate reporting requirements are able to do the climate gap analyses. And a part of that is the double materiality assessment. And it's very similar to what you just described in terms of security, compliance, and risk, because it allows companies to very easily identify that these risks or these opportunities are material to the ongoing success of our business. And it allows you to justify in your reporting why you're focusing on, say, the top 3 risks and the top 3 opportunities and not the next 6, for example. And you can say, because we don't believe that these are material at this stage to the ongoing success of our business. And so like that mechanism is inbuilt into the regulations. And so that's why, when I'm speaking to a company, there's 2 kinds of companies really when it comes to sustainability. There's the company that has an internal sustainability function, and there's the company that doesn't. The teams that do have the sustainability function, they're definitely further ahead, but that doesn't mean that companies that don't have a sustainability function either can't do the work or don't have to do the work, because they do. It's just a matter of figuring out who's going to be the internal stakeholder. Often that's someone who sits on the audit and risk committee at a board level. And then this reporting is now often sitting under the CFO from a strategy perspective, which I think makes sense. So that's the consulting bit. So they help with the reporting, that they help with the gap analysis, they help with the double materiality assessment. The data platforms, that's really where you get your carbon management platforms. And they're important because they're able to come in and based on how much you spend, they're able to help you determine what your emissions are based under the greenhouse gas protocol, which has many different emissions factors based on what's being measured, whether that be fuel. It's a pretty long list. They're really good at helping companies figure out exactly what their emissions profile looks like. And then the marketing agencies can come in and help companies really benefit from their decarbonization initiatives, so that they can position themselves well with investors, they can position themselves well with insurers, with customers, and with employees. One thing that I would say, and that it's very specific, that I refer to the communications agencies as the 3rd pillar. So the ACCC and ASIC have fired enough shots across the bow over the past few years when it comes to greenwashing that they are very quickly starting to move to a no-nonsense approach. There's been some very high-profile cases of greenwashing: Santos, Black Mountain Energy, Vanguard from a financial perspective, Mercer from a financial perspective, Glad, who make the plastic bags. They just had to pay millions in fines because they said that the plastic used for their bags was plastic that was ocean bound, and it was proven that it was not ocean bound. And so if they just said, we are using recycled plastics, they probably would have been fine. But because they put ocean bound, they're able to put a blue wave on the packaging. That was found to be misleading. The ACCC have actually released 8 guidelines, if you will, around what constitutes, like what companies can do to ensure they're not greenwashing. The very first one is really all you need to focus on. It's like, be truthful with your claims. The second one is have data to back up your claims. So things that appear to be common sense, but in a commercial competitive environment can really get companies into tricky situations. And so by working with the consultancies and by working with the data platforms, it means that the marketing agencies have quantifiable data, trends, and statistics that they can use in order for companies to benefit commercially. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. And I think just as we draw towards the kind of close here, I'd be interested to get your background on a couple of quotes that I've lifted from your website, which I really like. The first one is, networks are unique because they don't divide when you share them, they multiply. I really like that quote. So talk to me about that and why you put that on your website.
How good is the simplicity of that quote? So
Yeah, absolutely.
It's from a guy by the name of George Mack. So
Yeah.
when I was originally kicking around this business model in my mind, I kept on thinking, my whole career, I've always been the person in the middle. I'm very good at knowing who needs to speak to who has the problem, who has the solution, and putting them together. That's that. Like, if you wanted my career in a sentence, that's it. When I was first looking at this space and trying to figure out how do I tie my technology with my belief that sustainability was going to be, this core business driver. There's much bigger reasons why sustainability is the core business driver, but just from a pure commercial perspective, which you need to obviously have front and center when you're running a business. I just saw this trend picking up steam, and I realized that I could build a business based on introductions, which seems really simple now, but as I was trying to figure it out in my mind, it was really taking a long time to figure out, like what is the actual revenue model? Who am I helping? Why am I helping them? And how can I help them so that their lives and businesses are better? And then this just popped into my email one day. Like, I have no idea when I signed up to George's newsletter. It's now a newsletter that I read regularly. But it was just one of those moments where it popped into my inbox, and it just solidified exactly what I was thinking.
It's absolutely
and
brilliant.
it's this sense of the power that comes from sharing and the power that comes from giving is far outweighs keeping things for yourself.
And on a similar kind of vein, that's one of the reasons why I set up Cohesis. It was around helping businesses, helping small and medium businesses. I'd come from some bigger corporate experience. I've been in some smaller organizations, but I got the biggest kind of buzz from helping smaller organizations. And it was exactly that when I realized that, especially coming to Australia, and I thought, well, I've got this experience. How can I help organizations basically make the right technology decisions? That's what we're all about. And it's around that kind of helping. And I completely agree with that. But I really love that quote. It's fantastic.
I think it's helping, but I think also what both of our companies do is we provide access to companies that wouldn't otherwise have access. Yeah. And there's a lot of power in doing that for the recipient.
Yeah, absolutely. And with coming over, I'm still working on my Australian accent, but coming over.
I don't know, Simon. I think you've got that one for life.
Too much. But coming over from the UK, it's not having a network. Basically, when I came over, I knew, I think when I landed in fact, it was actually 7 years ago yesterday when I landed. 3rd of December. Yeah. So just over 7 years now. I think I knew when I landed 2 people. And I stayed, and I was put up by one of them. And so it's been very much around building networks. And so from my perspective, it's like, if you help people, your network will grow and things like that. Yeah. And that multiplication really kind of, really resonates with me as well, because the more people you help, the bigger your network becomes and the more people you get to help, So no, I really like it. But I agree. It's around that access to provide something of use. Well, otherwise it's not helpful, but to provide something of use that can really help other businesses take that, whatever their next step or whatever problem they need to solve is actually helping them achieve that. Yeah. Anyhow, moving on to the next one. And this goes back to what you were talking about at the top of the conversation with the Paris Agreement. But this is a quote from Cristina Figueres, if I pronounced it correctly, former executive secretary of the UNFCCC. And what leads to further action, frankly, is the realization that it is in the enlightened self-interest to do the right thing. That is what led to the Paris Agreement, when all countries realized who's going to win from a dead planet. No one wins from a dead planet. And again, another great quote. And you can see how big big thinking like that leads to those kind of agreements, and from there look at what we've been speaking about today is in terms of the change which is coming down the track. So again, another awesome quote, but I mean, I can obviously guess why. I think you may have put that on the website, but do you want to talk about that yourself?
For sure. So Christiana Figueres is an absolute hero of mine. So her dad was the president of Costa Rica back in the 70s and 80s. So she grew up in tiny country, in the scheme of things, and yet has played such an outsized role in bringing together the largest countries in the world. She's so highly thought of by the US, by China, even by Russia, the Middle East countries, the European countries, Australia, Asian countries, because she has such an emphasis on the importance of building trust and understanding where people are coming from and not blaming people for having the opinions or the views that they have, but understanding what's important to them in order to close this deal. And I think she'll go down as one of the great multilateral negotiators, because her approach is everyone needs to get something for themselves. They don't have to get everything for themselves, but they cannot go home and speak to their country and say, we didn't get one thing for us. So if that is your approach, you have to build those levels of trust by understanding people's self-interest. And so that's step one. Step two, and I think sometimes the environmental space can get a little bit muddy with their messaging around this. Step two is not, we need to save the planet, right? What she's saying from a dead planet perspective is a planet that is not livable for humans. Like the planet will continue there's no question about that. It's whether the conditions remain as they have over the past few thousand years that have allowed humans to thrive. And so that's a pretty significant self-interest, I think, for most people, to ensure not only themselves, families, etc., living in conditions that are conducive to human life. And so her ability to bring those two ideas together and to actually show that the economics and the ethics have joined, I think is incredibly powerful, because for so long you were either had to be on the capitalist side or you had to be on the planet side, and that wasn't helping anyone. Whereas now it makes business sense to be sustainable first. And that, I think she's played an enormous role in getting us to that point.
Excellent. Well, look, I think that's a perfect way to end this conversation. Before we just kind of sign off, where can people find you? What is the best way for people to actually reach out to you?
Absolutely. So LinkedIn, I often say, is my natural habitat. So if you look for Dan Leverington on LinkedIn, you'll find me. The company's website is ocelli.group. We've got a weekly newsletter that I write called Honey Drops. We genuinely love talking to everyone and anyone, because we know that this is going to affect every company. So we're really keen to help anyone that needs it. And just very quickly, I would like to say thanks to you, not only for today's call, but our conversations over the past few months. I think your experience, the way that you look at problems, the solutions that naturally come to you, are such a good fit for this space, and helping companies bridge the divide between where they're at now to where they have to go, because there's so many parallels in sustainability with where technology was 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I genuinely believe that you have such a unique viewpoint that you can help companies cross that bridge.
Well, thank you for that. Checks in the post. Thank you for saying that. Well, look, we'll obviously talk much more offline as well, but thank you for your time today, Dan. And I've really enjoyed this, and it's quite nice. I actually personally, really enjoy these kind of conversations. This is the whole point of the Leaders Lounge, is to be able to have an interesting conversation with leaders with different perspectives that, when shared, other people, and I'm assuming and hoping that we'll get and grow an audience, that they will benefit from this and think about things in different ways. And we can only do that if we have good guests and people who are interesting as well. So thank you for going into the detail as well. One of the things that annoys me about many interviews and podcasts and stuff, not so much podcasts, but interviews, especially on mainstream media, is they don't give people time to generate a point or a thought or a concept. Yeah. And one of the things I like to try and do is to bout insights and thoughts, so to let people share what they know, which is hopefully going to be the way forward for what we do here. But thank you again.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Just on a last note, if you in the audience enjoyed this conversation, please like and share it within your network and your favorite podcast app. We are here to try and help inform and deliver a broad range of business insights to help business leaders like you make better decisions. If you would like to appear on the podcast or for us to address a particular topic, then please contact me at leadersloungepodcast@cohesis.com.au. And with that, thank you very much, Dan, and we'll speak soon.
Great. Thanks, Simon.